The air in the grand atrium was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged marble. Elias felt it clinging to the back of his throat, a cloying sweetness that was nothing like the dry, papery smell of the archives he loved. Here, under the gilded dome and the merciless glare of crystal chandeliers, he was an artifact out of place, a footnote in a language he did not speak. He adjusted the ill-fitting bow tie that came with the caterer's uniform, the starchy fabric chafing his neck. He clutched his empty tray like a shield, his knuckles white. His job tonight was simple: smile, collect empty champagne flutes, and be invisible. He was usually good at the invisible part. In his life, blending into the background had become a necessary skill, a form of armor. But tonight, the sheer scale of the museum's annual benefactor gala made him feel exposed, a single drab feather in a flock of peacocks. His gaze drifted over the crowd. Men in bespoke tuxedos laughed with booming confidence, their watches catching the light. Women in silks and jewels moved with a languid grace that spoke of lives lived without friction. They were the patrons, the donors, the people whose names were etched onto brass plaques in the wings Elias himself helped maintain. They owned this world. He was just borrowing a small, shadowed corner of it for a few hours. A small, frayed loop of braided thread on his wrist caught his eye. It was purple and pink, clumsily woven by a 5-year-old's determined fingers. Lily's bracelet. He twisted it, the familiar texture a grounding anchor in the glittering sea of strangers. It was a reminder of his real world, a world of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the pure, uncomplicated weight of a small hand in his. That was the world he fought for. This was just the battlefield. He scanned the room again, his eyes automatically searching for the one person who embodied the museum more than the billion-dollar collection it housed. Julian Allister, the museum director. He saw him across the atrium, standing near the new Hellenistic exhibit. He was not laughing. He rarely seemed to. Julian was a man carved from the same cool, elegant stone as the statues surrounding him. Tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, he radiated an aura of quiet, absolute authority. His hair was dark, shot through with distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his face was a study in controlled lines and sharp angles. But it was his eyes that always held Elias's attention from afar. They were a deep, thoughtful gray, and they missed nothing. Elias had seen that gaze sweep over board meetings and installation plans with the same discerning intensity. It was a gaze that catalogued, assessed, and understood. Tonight, however, a weariness shadowed that intensity. Julian held a glass but did not drink from it, his posture betraying a tension that the perfect cut of his suit could not completely hide. He looked as isolated in his position of power as Elias felt in his anonymity. A strange, fleeting sense of connection passed through Elias, a shared feeling of being on display, performing a role. Then the performance shattered. A familiar voice, slick with a malice Elias could recognize in his sleep, cut through the sophisticated hum of the crowd. "Well, well, look what we have here. Playing dress-up with the grown-ups, Elias?" Elias froze. The tray in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He did not have to turn to know who it was. The sound of that voice was a ghost that had haunted his quiet moments for 2 years. Mark. He forced himself to turn slowly. Mark stood there, a smirk playing on his handsome face. He was everything Elias was not. Effortlessly confident, dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than Elias's rent for 6 months, and radiating the easy privilege of a man who had never been told no. He was a guest, a donor's son, a legitimate part of this world Elias was only pretending to inhabit. "Mark," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Mark said, his eyes raking over Elias's server uniform with open contempt. Though I think I have my answer. Still slumming it, I see. I thought you had more pride. Elias's jaw tightened. He clutched the tray harder. I'm working. Please, just leave me alone. Leave you alone? But the party's just getting started. Mark took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss that was more threatening than any shout. You look tired, Eli. Is our little girl running you ragged? You know, you never should have tried to raise her on your own. You're not cut out for it. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, striking at the heart of Elias's deepest insecurities. The bracelet on his wrist suddenly felt like a brand, a symbol of his perceived failure. He took a step back, his heel catching on the plush edge of the rug. That's not your concern, Elias managed, his voice trembling slightly. Oh, but it is, Mark purred, his smile widening. He gestured vaguely toward a nearby pedestal. Everything here is about legacy, isn't it? Preservation. I'm just concerned about my legacy. He put a possessive emphasis on the word my, a chilling reminder of the battles Elias had fought to keep Lily safe, to erase Mark's name from their lives. Panic began to cloud Elias's vision. He felt the eyes of nearby guests turning toward them, their polite chatter faltering. He was becoming a scene, a disruption in the seamless tapestry of the evening. He had to get away. He tried to sidestep Mark, to retreat into the invisibility he coveted, but Mark moved with him, blocking his path. We're not done talking. Yes, we are. Elias's voice was firmer now, fueled by a surge of protective anger for his daughter. Mark's smile vanished. His face hardened. You don't get to decide that. He gave Elias a sharp, deliberate shove. It was not hard enough to be overt aggression, but it was perfectly calculated to unbalance him. Elias stumbled backward. His arm flew out, trying to catch his balance. The metal tray slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering loudly against the polished marble floor. His body followed, colliding with the slender marble pedestal behind him. Time seemed to slow down. He heard a collective gasp from the onlookers. He saw the object on the pedestal, a delicate Ming Dynasty porcelain vase, no bigger than his hand, wobble precariously. It teetered for one agonizing second, a perfect blue and white jewel poised on the brink. Then it fell. The sound of it shattering on the marble was a gunshot in the pristine quiet of the atrium. It was a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed up into the domed ceiling, silencing every conversation. Hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on him, on the glittering shards of history scattered around his feet. Mortification washed over him, hot and suffocating. This was not just a broken dish. This was a piece of irreplaceable art, a piece of the museum he loved, destroyed by his clumsiness. He had not just made a scene. He had committed a sacrilege. Security guards began to move in, their expressions grim. Mark looked down at the wreckage, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, before he molded his expression into one of shock and concern. My God, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He's so clumsy. I just tried to talk to him and he... Elias felt his world collapsing. He would be fired. He would be prosecuted. The cost of the vase would be a debt that would follow him for the rest of his life. He saw his fragile stability, the little life he had built for himself and Lily, shattering right alongside the porcelain. And then, a calm voice cut through the chaos. That's enough. Julian Allister was there. He had moved through the crowd with a silent, unnerving speed. He stood between Elias and the approaching guards, his presence a sudden, unbreachable wall. He did not look at the broken vase. He did not look at the gawking crowd. His cool gray eyes were fixed on Elias. Elias stared back, trapped in that intense gaze. He expected to see fury, disappointment, contempt. But he saw something else. A flicker of understanding. An assessment that went beyond the immediate disaster. Julian's gaze shifted for a fraction of a second to Mark, and his expression hardened into something cold and sharp as chipped flint. Then his eyes returned to Elias, softening almost imperceptibly. He addressed the head of security with a quiet command that brooked no argument. "Stand down. I will handle this personally." The guard hesitated, then gave a curt nod and motioned for his men to step back. The crowd began to murmur, sensing a shift in the drama. Julian took a step toward Elias, his movements deliberate and calm. He ignored Mark completely, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He stopped in front of Elias, who was still frozen on the floor amidst the porcelain shards. "Are you all right?" Julian asked. His voice was low, meant only for Elias. The sound of it, a deep and steady baritone, cut through the panicked ringing in Elias's ears. Elias could only nod, unable to form words. Julian extended a hand. It was a clean, strong hand, with long, capable fingers. After a moment's hesitation, Elias took it. Julian's grip was firm and warm, and he pulled Elias to his feet with an easy strength that was surprising. He did not let go immediately. He kept his hand on Elias's arm, a steadying, protective weight. Then he turned his head slightly, his voice rising just enough to be heard by those nearby. "He is with me." The 3 words fell into the charged silence with the weight of a royal decree. They were ambiguous, yet definitive. They claimed him. They shielded him. They rewrote the narrative from clumsy server to guest of the director. Mark opened his mouth to protest, his face a mask of disbelief. "With you? He's a waiter who just destroyed a priceless antique." Julian finally turned his full attention to Mark. The look in his eyes was glacial. "I am aware of what happened. As I said, I will handle it." He then looked back at Elias, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said, his voice once again a quiet command meant only for him. He did not wait for an answer. He simply turned, his hand still resting lightly on Elias's elbow, and began to lead him away from the wreckage of his career, away from the prying eyes, away from Mark's poisonous presence. He led him through a side door marked "Staff Only," and the opulent noise of the gala was instantly muffled, replaced by the quiet, humming silence of the museum's hidden heart. The hallway was stark and utilitarian, lit by fluorescent tubes that cast a sterile, greenish light. The air here smelled different, of floor polish and old paper. It was the museum Elias knew, the one behind the curtain. Julian's hand never left his arm, a constant, reassuring pressure that kept Elias's legs from giving out beneath him. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing softly on the linoleum floor. Julian bypassed his own grand office, with its mahogany desk and panoramic city views. He bypassed the staff lounges and the administrative sector. He led Elias deeper into the building, through a series of keycard-protected doors, until they reached a heavy steel door with a small, unassuming plaque that read, "Conservation and Restoration." Julian swiped a card, and the lock clicked open. He pushed the door inward, ushering Elias into a room that felt like a sanctuary. It was a laboratory, but it was unlike any Elias had ever seen. It was vast and silent, filled with long tables of pale maple wood. On the tables, under focused lamps, lay artifacts in various states of repair. A fragmented Roman mosaic, a medieval tapestry draped in muslin, a row of Egyptian pottery being painstakingly pieced together. The air smelled of specialized solvents, linseed oil, and something ancient, like dust and time itself. The only sound was the gentle hum of the climate control system. Julian finally released Elias's arm, the sudden absence of his touch leaving Elias feeling strangely adrift. He gestured toward a simple wooden stool. "Sit." Elias obeyed, perching on the edge of the stool. He watched as Julian moved over to a small, immaculate sink in the corner. He ran the water, the sound soft in the quiet room, and methodically washed his hands. There was something ritualistic about the action, a cleansing of the chaos they had just left behind. Julian dried his hands on a clean linen towel, then turned to face Elias. He leaned back against one of the heavy workbenches, crossing his arms over his chest. His expression was serious, but the coldness was gone, replaced by a quiet contemplation. "I am not going to ask you what that cost," Elias said, his voice hoarse. He had to say it. He had to face it. "I know I can never—" "The vase was insured for a regrettable amount of money," Julian interrupted, his voice calm and even. "But its true value was historical, not monetary. And no, you will not be paying for it." Elias stared at him, bewildered. "But I destroyed it. I have to be held responsible." "Responsibility is not always so straightforward," Julian said, his gray eyes studying Elias's face. "I saw the man who pushed you, Mark Thorne. His father is a minor patron with an inflated sense of importance." He paused. "He seemed to know you." It was not a question, but it hung in the air like one. Elias looked down at his hands, at the frayed little bracelet. The shame was a physical weight in his chest. "He's my daughter's father. We haven't been together for a long time." Julian's expression did not change, but a new stillness came over him. "I see." A heavy silence settled between them. Elias braced himself for the judgment, for the questions about his personal life, for the inevitable dismissal. Instead, Julian pushed himself off the workbench and walked over to a steel cabinet. He opened it and took out a small, sealed first aid kit. "You have a cut on your hand," Julian said, his tone matter of fact. Elias looked down. He hadn't even noticed. A thin red line beaded with blood ran across his palm, likely from a shard of the porcelain. It was a trivial injury, but in that moment, it felt profound. Julian came back with the kit and a bottle of water. He knelt in front of Elias, a startling gesture that brought the powerful museum director down to his level. The scent of his cologne was subtle, a clean, woody fragrance of cedar and bergamot. It was a grounding, solid smell. "May I?" Julian asked, his gaze meeting Elias's. Elias nodded numbly. With a surgeon's precision, Julian opened the kit. He took out an antiseptic wipe and gently, so gently, began to clean the cut. His touch was feather-light, yet incredibly steady. It was a curator's touch, accustomed to handling fragile, priceless things. The sting of the antiseptic was sharp, but it was overshadowed by the unexpected intimacy of the moment. The director of the entire museum was kneeling on the floor, tending to a cut on his hand. "He does this," Elias heard himself say, the words tumbling out in a rush of exhausted confession. "He finds me. He tries to unravel things, to make me feel small." Julian paused in his work, his thumb resting near the pulse point on Elias's wrist. He looked up, his gray eyes holding an unnerving clarity. People like that derive their power from the belief that no one will ever stand in their way. He finished cleaning the wound and applied a small, neat bandage. His fingers brushed against Elias's skin for a moment longer than necessary. It was the first moment of non-essential, gentle physical contact. A touch that was not about steadying him or leading him, but about something quieter, something more personal. It sent a strange warmth spreading up Elias's arm. Julian stood up, putting the supplies away with an economy of motion. "You work in the archives, don't you? Elias Thorne?" Elias flinched at the surname. "Just Elias. I'm changing it back. It's a process." "Elias," Julian corrected himself smoothly. "I've read your cataloging notes on the medieval manuscripts. Your work is meticulous. You have a good eye." The unexpected praise was more disarming than any reprimand could have been. "Thank you," Elias whispered. "This lab," Julian said, changing the subject as he gestured around the silent room, "is my private space. Very few people come here. It's the only place in this entire building where things can be broken and still have the hope of being made whole again." The words resonated deep within Elias, a quiet acknowledgement of his own shattered state. He felt a profound, aching sense of safety in this room, under the watchful, calm gaze of this intimidating, gentle man. He was not being interrogated. He was being sheltered. "What happens now?" Elias asked, the fear creeping back into his voice. "About the gala? About my job?" "For now, you will go home," Julian said. "I will have my driver take you. I will deal with the board. I will deal with Mr. Thorne. Your job is safe." He paused, his expression unreadable. "Consider yourself under my protection, Elias." The next day, the museum was a hive of whispers. Elias could feel the stares as he walked to the archives, the sudden silences as he passed. The story of the shattered vase had taken on a life of its own, twisted and embellished with every telling. His friend Mia, a registrar with a sharp wit and even sharper eyes, cornered him by the manuscript cabinets. "Okay, spill," she said, her arms crossed. "The entire museum is buzzing. One minute you're a catering staff member, the next you're being personally escorted out by Julian Allister himself with a cryptic, 'He's with me.' Are you his long-lost nephew? Secret lover? What is going on?" Elias felt a flush creep up his neck. "It's nothing, Mia. It was a misunderstanding." "A $200,000 misunderstanding?" she countered, raising an eyebrow. "I saw Mark Thorne there. Let me guess, this has his slimy fingerprints all over it." Elias just nodded, not trusting his voice. Mia's expression softened. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry." She squeezed his arm. "But you have to admit, having the Ice King himself ride to your rescue is pretty epic. I've never seen him show that much anything for anyone." The Ice King. That was the staff's nickname for Julian. It suited his public persona, cool, remote, untouchable. But it did not fit the man who had knelt on the floor to bandage his hand, his touch so careful and warm. Later that morning, the inevitable summons came. Julian's assistant, a severe woman named Eleanor, informed him that Mr. Allister requested his presence in his office. With a sense of dread, Elias made his way to the top floor. The office was as intimidating as he remembered, a vast expanse of glass and steel overlooking the city. Julian was standing by the window, his back to the door. He turned as Elias entered. "Close the door," he said. Elias did, the heavy wood clicking shut with a sound of finality. "The board is concerned," Julian began, his tone measured. "Mr. Thorne has been making calls. He's painting a picture of an unstable employee with a personal grudge. He is suggesting the incident was deliberate." Elias's blood ran cold. "That's a lie." "I know," Julian said simply. "But he is a donor's son, and the board is composed of people who value donations above almost everything else. They are suggesting a suspension, pending an investigation." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. Suspension meant no pay. He was already living paycheck to paycheck. He thought of Lily, of their small apartment, of the bills piling up. The panic he had felt at the gala returned, sharp and suffocating. "No," Elias whispered. "I can't. I need this job." Julian watched him, his gray eyes tracking the wave of fear that washed over Elias's face. He seemed about to say something when a small, timid knock sounded at the door. Both men started. Julian's assistant would never interrupt him without buzzing first. The door creaked open, and a small head with a mop of unruly brown curls peeked in. Lily. "Papa?" she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the enormous office. Elias's heart leaped into his throat. "Lily, what are you doing here?" He had been forced to bring her with him today, his regular babysitter having canceled at the last minute. He had left her in the archives with Mia, armed with a coloring book and strict instructions not to move. Lily padded into the room, clutching a slightly crumpled drawing. "Mia had to take a phone call. I finished my picture. I wanted to show you." She stopped when she saw Julian, her eyes growing even wider. She looked from the tall, imposing man to her father and back again. Elias rushed to her side, kneeling down. "Sweetheart, you can't be in here. This is Mr. Allister's office. We have to go." But Julian moved forward, his steps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped a few feet away, his intimidating presence seeming to shrink as he looked down at the small child. He did not smile, but the hard lines of his face softened. "It is quite all right," Julian said, his deep voice much gentler than Elias had ever heard it. "And who is this?" Lily, usually shy around strangers, looked up at Julian with a child's unfiltered curiosity. She held out her drawing. It was a wobbly, crayon depiction of two stick figures holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. "This is me and my papa," she announced proudly. Julian crouched down, bringing himself to her level. It was a mirror of his gesture in the lab the night before, and it struck Elias with the same force. He took the drawing carefully, holding it as if it were a precious manuscript. "It is a masterpiece," Julian said with grave seriousness. "The use of color is very bold." Lily beamed. She took a step closer, her head tilted as she studied his face. "You have sad eyes," she said with the brutal honesty of a 5-year-old. "But they're kind, like my papa's." Elias froze, mortified. "Lily, you can't say things like that." But Julian did not seem offended. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered in his gray eyes. He looked from Lily to Elias, a silent question passing between them. The innocent, absolute trust in the child's gaze seemed to breach a defense in him that no adult ever could. "Thank you," Julian said to Lily, his voice a low rumble. "That is a very high compliment." He then looked at Elias, a decision solidifying in his gaze. The weariness was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new resolve. "The board's suggestion of a suspension is unacceptable," Julian stated, rising to his full height. "It will not be happening." He walked over to his desk, his movements suddenly crisp and decisive. He picked up his phone. "Eleanor, clear my schedule for the rest of the day. And get our legal counsel on the line. I want to discuss filing a restraining order on behalf of an employee." He hung up and looked directly at Elias. "Mark Thorne will not bother you or your daughter again, and you will not be suspended. However, the optics of this situation are complicated. The board needs to be placated. Gossip needs to be managed." He paused, his eyes intense. "For the time being, the story will be the one I created last night. That you are with me. That the incident was a personal matter, a lover's quarrel that unfortunately involved museum property. It is an unorthodox solution, but it is the only one that protects your position and silences Thorn. Elias stared at him, his mind reeling. A fake relationship. A public performance. It was insane. It was terrifying. You would do that? Why? Julian's gaze dropped to Lily, who was now tugging on Elias's sleeve, oblivious to the adult drama swirling around her. His expression softened again. Let's just say, Julian said, his voice quiet, I have a vested interest in the preservation of rare and valuable things. The lie took root faster than Elias could have imagined. Within days, the museum was a different kind of buzzing. The narrative had shifted. Elias was no longer the clumsy archivist who destroyed a priceless artifact. He was the director's secret boyfriend. The whispers followed him, but now they were tinged with awe and curiosity rather than pity and scorn. It was a strange, disorienting existence. He and Julian performed their roles with a quiet, understated precision. A shared coffee in the staff cafeteria became a public spectacle. Julian, stopping by the archives to ask about a manuscript, was dissected for hidden meaning by everyone who witnessed it. Julian insisted on driving him and Lily home each evening, the sleek, silent interior of his black car becoming a temporary sanctuary where the lines between pretend and real began to blur. During those rides, Julian would speak to Lily, asking her about her day with a gentle gravity that always made her giggle. He learned that her favorite animal was a penguin, that she hated peas, and that her best friend was a little boy named Sam who could wiggle his ears. Elias would watch them in the rearview mirror, a powerful, lonely man and a little girl with a crayon drawing, and feel a dangerous warmth unfurling in his chest. But the performance was a gilded cage. Mark, enraged at being so thoroughly outmaneuvered, did not disappear. He could no longer attack Elias directly at the museum, but his malice found other outlets. It started with anonymous, threatening comments on the museum's social media posts whenever a picture of Julian appeared. Then, one evening, Elias found the tires on his old, beat-up car slashed. He stood in the dimly lit parking garage, staring at the flat tires, a cold dread seeping into his bones. This was an escalation. This was a message. He called Julian. He hated to do it, hated to be a burden, but he had Lily with him, and the thought of taking the bus late at night with Mark somewhere in the city made him physically ill. Julian was there in 15 minutes. He did not ask questions. He simply took one look at the tires, another at Elias's pale face, and his own expression hardened into granite. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low, angry growl. He ushered a sleepy Lily into the warm safety of his car before turning back to Elias. "You and Lily will stay with me. It is not a request." And so, the forced proximity began. Julian's home was a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city, a minimalist masterpiece of glass, steel, and stone. It was beautiful and stark, a fortress of solitude. There were no family photos, no clutter, no personal touches save for the shelves of rare books that lined one entire wall. It was the home of a man who lived his life with the same controlled precision he ran his museum. Bringing Lily into that space felt like introducing a wildflower into a sterile laboratory. She immediately filled the silent rooms with her laughter, her toys, her small, vibrant presence. To Elias's astonishment, Julian did not seem to mind. He watched her with a quiet, almost hungry fascination, as if she were a creature from another world. One evening, Elias came out of the guest room to find the living room floor covered in a complex construction of building blocks. Lily was directing the project with the authority of a seasoned architect, and Julian was on his hands and knees on the expensive Persian rug, carefully placing a blue block onto a teetering tower. "No, Juju," Lily corrected him sternly, using the nickname she had invented for him. "The pointy one goes on top. It's the castle flag. Of course. My apologies, Madam Architect, Julian replied with perfect seriousness, swapping the blocks. Elias leaned against the doorframe, his heart aching with a feeling he could not name. He was watching a man who commanded boards and managed multi-million-dollar endowments patiently build a block castle with his daughter. The contrast was so profound, so deeply touching, that it made his breath catch. This was their new reality, a strange domesticity born of a lie, but it was starting to feel more real than anything he had known in years. Living together eroded the formal boundaries between them. Elias saw Julian without his perfectly tailored suits, dressed in soft gray sweaters that made him look younger, more approachable. He saw the way he rubbed his temples when he was tired, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that his public persona never betrayed. He learned Julian's quiet routines, the early morning coffee on the terrace overlooking the awakening city, the late nights spent reading in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. They fell into a rhythm of shared meals and quiet evenings. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but companionable, filled with the unspoken understanding of two lonely people who had found an unexpected harbor in each other. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the glass walls of the penthouse. Lily, terrified of thunder, had a nightmare and woke up screaming. Elias rushed to her room, but Julian was already there. He was sitting on the edge of her bed, speaking in a low, soothing voice, his large hand stroking her hair. "It's just the sky making a big noise," Elias heard him murmur. "It can't hurt you. You're safe in here." Elias watched from the doorway as Julian calmed his daughter, his heart constricting. He was witnessing an act of such profound tenderness it felt like an intrusion. He was seeing the man behind the Ice King mask, a man who knew how to soothe a child's fears because, perhaps, he was intimately familiar with his own. But the safety of the penthouse could not keep the outside world at bay forever. Mark's harassment grew more desperate. He began sending Elias messages filled with venom and threats, detailing his movements, proving he was still watching. He sent one with a photo of Lily's school playground, taken from a distance. That was the breaking point. Elias stared at the photo on his phone, his blood turning to ice. The carefully constructed calm he had been nurturing shattered into a million pieces. A visceral, primal fear seized him. It was not about him anymore. It was about Lily. He found Julian in his study, reviewing some documents. Elias threw the phone down on the polished desk, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "He was at her school," he choked out, the words tasting like acid. "He was watching her." Julian looked at the photo. The calm, controlled mask he wore every day cracked. For the first time, Elias saw pure, undiluted fury in his eyes. It was a terrifying sight. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is over." But the fear in Elias was too great to be soothed by promises. It was a raw, gaping wound from years of Mark's control and abuse. The illusion of safety had been ripped away, leaving him exposed and terrified. "You don't understand," Elias cried, his voice breaking. He began to pace the room, his movements jerky and frantic. "People like him don't just stop. A restraining order is a piece of paper. He will never leave us alone. He wants to hurt me, and he will use her to do it. There is nowhere we can go where he won't find us." The dam of his composure broke, and all the fear, the exhaustion, the hopelessness of the past few years came pouring out. "I can't do this anymore," he sobbed, sinking into a chair and burying his face in his hands. "I'm so tired of being afraid." The room fell silent, the only sound Elias's ragged breaths. He felt a presence before him and looked up through his tear-blurred vision. Julian was kneeling in front of him, just as he had in the lab, just as he had with Lily. He reached out, not to touch him, but simply holding his hands out, an offering of silent support.
"I know what it is to be afraid," Julian said, his voice raw with an emotion Elias had never heard before. "I know what it is to have someone try to take everything from you." Elias stared at him, his sobs quieting. "Before the museum, before all of this," Julian continued, his gaze distant, lost in a memory, "I had a partner. Not in business, in life. He was brilliant, charming, and he was a ruinous gambler. He used my name, my family's money, my trust. He forged my signature, created a web of debt so vast it nearly destroyed everything my father had built. When I discovered it, when I tried to stop him, he threatened to destroy my reputation, to fabricate scandals that would have ruined me professionally and personally." It was a stunning confession, a glimpse into a past that Julian kept locked away behind his impenetrable facade. He was not just a protector, he had been a victim. He understood. "I was terrified,"
Julian admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "For a long time, I let him control me with that fear. I paid off debts, I looked the other way. I became a prisoner in my own life. Until one day, I realized that living in fear was its own kind of destruction. It was slow, quiet, but just as complete." He finally looked at Elias, his gray eyes filled with a deep, painful empathy. "I had to fight back. Not just for my money or my name, but for myself. I used my resources, my power, and I systematically dismantled his life until he had no leverage left. I broke him before he could finish breaking me. And I have been alone ever since. I built this life, this fortress," he gestured around the silent, beautiful apartment, "to ensure no one could ever have that kind of power over me again." He finally reached out, his fingers gently touching Elias's cheek, wiping away a tear. The touch was electric, a jolt of shared vulnerability and understanding that arced between them. "You are not alone in this fight, Elias," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will not let him hurt you. I will not let him hurt Lily. I have more resources, more power, and more to lose now than I ever did then." Elias searched his face, seeing the truth of his words reflected in the fierce, protective light in his eyes. The fear in his own heart began to recede, replaced by a powerful, surging wave of something else. Gratitude, trust, and something deeper, something that had been quietly growing in the spaces between their pretense. "Why?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing all of this for us?" Julian's thumb stroked his cheek, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. His gaze dropped to Elias's lips. "Because when you and Lily walked into this sterile, empty life I built, you filled it with light. Because the thought of that light being extinguished is unbearable." He leaned in slowly, giving Elias every chance to pull away. But Elias did not move. He leaned forward, meeting him halfway. Their lips met. The kiss was not tentative or questioning. It was a release of all the tension, the fear, the unspoken longing that had been building between them for weeks. It was deep and certain, a confirmation of everything that had become real behind the facade of their lie. It tasted of salt from Elias's tears and the faint, lingering taste of whiskey on Julian's breath. It was a kiss that felt like a vow, a promise of safety and a confession of need, all in one. In that kiss, in the solid warmth of Julian's hands cupping his face, Elias finally, truly, felt safe. The storm outside raged on, but inside the fortress, in the arms of his unexpected guardian, he was finally home. The morning after the kiss, The world felt both terrifyingly new and irrevocably settled. A quiet intensity now charged the space between them. The pretense had been burned away, leaving a raw, authentic connection in its place. They were no longer playing roles. Julian was a man of decisive action. The vulnerability he had shown was not a weakness, but a catalyst. He spent the morning on the phone, his voice a low, commanding tone that Elias could hear from the other room. He was speaking to lawyers, to private investigators, to contacts Elias could not even imagine. He was not just building a defense, he was mounting an offensive. By midday, a plan was in motion. A team of lawyers was compiling every piece of evidence of Mark's harassment, the texts, the social media comments, the security footage from the museum parking garage showing him near Elias's car. A top-tier investigator was digging into Mark's life, searching for the leverage Julian knew must exist. While Julian marshaled his forces, he also made a different kind of call. He convened an emergency meeting of the museum's board of directors.
"I need you there," he said to Elias, his expression serious. "We will face them together." The idea sent a spike of anxiety through Elias, but looking at the resolve in Julian's eyes, he found his own. He nodded. Together. They walked into the boardroom side by side. The long, polished table was surrounded by the stern, wealthy faces of the men and women who held the museum's fate in their hands. The atmosphere was thick with disapproval. Julian did not wait for them to speak. He stood at the head of the table, Elias at his shoulder, a silent, united front. "I have called this meeting to address the situation regarding Elias Thorne," Julian began, his voice ringing with authority. He purposefully used the surname, the one Elias was shedding, to link him to the source of the conflict, and to inform you of the measures I am taking to resolve it. He laid out the facts with cold, irrefutable clarity. He detailed Mark Thorne's history of harassment, presenting a file prepared by his legal team. He spoke of the threats, the slashed tires, the stalking. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was no longer gossip about a clumsy employee. It was a serious security issue. "Mr. Thorne's father is a valued patron," one of the older board members, a man named Henderson, grumbled. "This is a delicate matter." "It ceased to be delicate when my employee and his child were threatened," Julian countered, his voice like ice. "The safety of my staff is not negotiable. Elias's position at this museum is secure. That is not up for discussion." Then he did something that stunned the entire room, including Elias. "However," Julian continued, "the initial narrative I provided to contain the situation was, in fact, a fiction, designed to protect Elias from immediate professional harm. While our relationship has since evolved, at the time of the incident, we were not involved. My statement that he was with me was an act of protection, not a confession of romance." He let that sink in. He was admitting to misleading them, but he was doing it from a position of unassailable strength. "I take full responsibility for the broken vase. It will be covered by my personal funds, not by the museum's insurance, to avoid any further official inquiries. Furthermore, I am implementing a new museum-wide policy regarding staff security and harassment to be drafted by our legal counsel. Mark Thorne will be issued a formal notice banning him from museum property and all museum events, effective immediately. His father can choose to withdraw his patronage if he wishes. We will endure." He had taken control of the entire situation, reframing it from a personal scandal into a matter of institutional integrity. He had protected Elias, neutralized the board's power, and drawn a clear, unambiguous line in the sand. But he was not finished. He looked at Elias, then back at the board. "The one truth in all of this is what has grown from it. Elias and I are, now, together. Any concerns regarding conflicts of interest are moot. I am restructuring the archival department's reporting line.
Elias will now report to the head of collections, not to me. My personal life will not interfere with my professional duties, but nor will my duties prevent me from having a personal life. It was a masterclass in power and control. He had confessed, taken responsibility, provided a solution, and declared his intentions, leaving them no room to argue. He had sacrificed his own impeccable private reputation to build a fortress around Elias, one made of truth instead of lies. They walked out of the boardroom into a stunned silence. Elias felt lightheaded. In the space of 20 minutes, Julian had rewritten their reality, making it solid and real in the one place it had been a performance.
"You didn't have to do that," Elias said, his voice full of awe. "You told them the truth."
The lie served its purpose, Julian said, turning to him in the empty hallway. It kept you safe when we needed it. But I have no intention of spending my life with you hiding behind a lie. He reached out and took Elias's hand, lacing their fingers together. It was the first time he had done so in the open, in the halls of the museum. It was a simple, public declaration. No more pretending, Elias. The resolution of the threat itself was swift and clinical. The private investigator Julian hired uncovered a history of embezzlement in Mark's own business dealings. Armed with this leverage, Julian's lawyers met with Mark and his father. The terms were simple. Mark would disappear from Elias and Lily's life forever, or his own life would be systematically dismantled. Faced with financial ruin and public disgrace, Mark crumbled. The threats stopped. The messages ceased. A profound, unbelievable silence fell where the fear had been. It was over. 3 months later, the city was draped in the golden hues of late autumn. The crisp air carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Elias stood on the balcony of a house he now called home. It was not the stark penthouse, but a warm, sprawling brownstone Julian had bought, with a small backyard where Lily could play. He watched as Julian and Lily worked together in the small garden patch at the edge of the yard. They were planting tulip bulbs, preparing the earth for the spring to come. Lily, covered in dirt and giggling, handed Julian a bulb as if it were a precious jewel. Julian, dressed in an old sweater and worn jeans, took it with that same familiar gravity, carefully placing it into the hole he had dug. The scene was so perfectly, peacefully domestic, it made Elias's heart ache with a joy so fierce it was almost painful. This was his life now, a life of quiet mornings, shared laughter, and the steady, reassuring presence of the man who had walked into his chaos and created a world of safety. Julian looked up and saw him watching. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a sight that was no longer rare, but one that Elias still treasured every time he saw it. He beckoned for him to come down. Elias joined them in the garden, kneeling in the soft earth beside Julian. Lily immediately scrambled into his lap, babbling about how their flowers would be the prettiest on the whole street. They absolutely will be, Elias agreed, kissing the top of her messy head. Julian reached over, his dirt-smudged hand gently cupping Elias's cheek. His touch was as warm and steady as it had been that first night in the lab. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "More than I ever thought possible," Elias replied, leaning into his touch. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the three of them, a small family unit turning over the soil, planting seeds of a future they would watch grow together. The ghosts of the past were gone, vanquished not by a single grand gesture, but by 1,000 small moments of steadfast love and quiet protection. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, they stood by the large window in the living room, looking out at the glittering city lights. A soft blanket was draped over their shoulders, and Elias leaned his head against Julian's chest,
listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart.
"Do you remember that first night?" Elias asked softly. "At the gala?" "I remember every second of it," Julian replied, his arms tightening around him. "I remember seeing you across the room and thinking you looked like you were holding your breath. And then I remember seeing him approach you, and the look on your face. I knew, even then, that I couldn't just stand by." "You said, 'He is with me,'" Elias murmured, the memory still vivid. "You pretended I was yours to protect me." Julian turned him in his arms, his gray eyes soft in the dim light. He lifted a hand to Elias's face, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Yes," he said, his voice deep and certain. "I pretended you were mine." He leaned down, his lips brushing against Elias's. "And now you are," he whispered against his mouth. "And I am yours. No more pretending." He kissed him, a slow, gentle kiss, full of the quiet promises of 1,000 tomorrows. It was a kiss that sealed their new reality. A future built not on a foundation of lies or pretense, but on the enduring truth of finding a home, a family, and a love that was strong enough to make broken things whole again. Outside, the city hummed its endless song, but here, in the quiet of their shared life, they had found their own perfect, peaceful silence.